Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. and our discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lecture, I discussed the early going in the Korean War and the struggles of the American and United Nations forces, which eventually, though, established a defensive perimeter and began to restore the balance of power in Korea. In this lecture, I'll turn to the remainder of the conflict in Korea and its most important American figure, General Douglas MacArthur. There is no substitute for winning, General Douglas MacArthur said in 1951 during his famous farewell address. This became favorite chalkboard material for coaches everywhere who are thankful for this famous utterance. But it also indicated one of the issues that Douglas MacArthur had in this final stage of his career and what became a growing rivalry with President Harry Truman. MacArthur understood only winning the war outright. He didn't really understand containment or its rationale, or, in some ways, moderation. He grew frustrated with leaders like Truman and others in Europe who thought that the action in Korea was perhaps growing too aggressive and became a global threat. So in this lecture, I'll talk about MacArthur and his controversial role in the duration of the rest of the Korean War. Douglas MacArthur is one of the most highly decorated soldiers and officers in the history of the American military. He was born into a military family in 1880 and graduated top of his class from West Point in 1903. His military service commenced with the Filipino insurrection following the Spanish-American War in 1898, and he ultimately served for more than 60 years. He rose to the rank of brigadier general amidst the fighting on the Western Front in Europe during World War I, served as the superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, among various other duties between the World Wars, and resumed active duty in 1941 as the commander of the U.S. Army forces in the Far East during World War II. He was forced to retreat from the Philippines after the Japanese defeated American forces throughout the Western Pacific after the attack at Pearl Harbor, uttering the famous phrase, "I shall return." MacArthur did indeed return to the Philippines as the United States achieved victory over Japan, and it was MacArthur who accepted the Japanese surrender in 1945. He then oversaw the Japanese recovery in the years after the war. MacArthur was thus extremely seasoned in the field and very familiar with conditions in Asia, so he was a logical choice for Truman to appoint to lead the United Nations forces in Korea. MacArthur steadied the situation in South Korea at first, building up the American and United Nations presence, and eventually planning and overseeing the smashingly successful counterattack at Incheon. By mid-July 1950, MacArthur and his forces had stopped the northern advance and restored roughly the lines of before the war. At that point, the administration began to weigh the pros and cons of continuing the war into North Korea. The greatest fear was that advancing the war might invoke the intervention of either the Soviet Union or the Chinese. Stalin had already made many statements that the Soviets were out of Korea and not interested in joining the conflict. Also, members of Truman's administration wagered that Stalin would not join the fray because it was clear the United States had a greater arsenal of nuclear weapons. The administration was also not too worried about a Chinese invasion. They were convinced that Mao was controlled by Stalin, and that if Stalin didn't act, neither would Mao. And MacArthur especially did not respect the Chinese military. Even if they did invade, MacArthur declared that if the Chinese intervened, there would be the greatest slaughter. With these calculations in mind, Truman signed an order for MacArthur to advance beyond the 38th parallel on September 11, 1950. 4 days later, MacArthur orchestrated a brilliant attack at Incheon, behind North Korean lines, and began to drive the North Koreans back. This was the largest amphibious attack in world history, behind only the D-Day invasion itself. Truman applauded the attack and authorized MacArthur to continue his advance through North Korea as long as the Chinese and Soviets did not intervene and as long as victory was certain. MacArthur obliged, and the United Nations forces drove deep into North Korea. On October 16th, the first Chinese so-called volunteers began coming across the Yalu River into North Korea. By late October, United Nations forces were taking occasional Chinese prisoners. And by November, MacArthur had reached the Yalu River. He grandly announced an offensive that would end the war. He itched to cross the border and finally win the war itself. The tide of the war had turned dramatically from those early weeks when American and UN forces were pushed back to the Pusan perimeter, to now in November, when they had driven all the way through North Korea and up to the border with China. Now there was something of an intense standoff near the Chinese border, as both sides contemplated what to do next. Should the United States proceed even further, launching attacks into China to secure the entirety of Korea as one unified presence? Or should they pull back at the risk of provoking Chinese intervention? Both sides during October debated what might happen next, and as we proceed over the next few points of this discussion, we'll see what happened next. Truman and MacArthur had numerous conversations about the prospect of Chinese or Soviet interference, as this exchange on October 15th of 1950, where Truman says, "What are the chances for Chinese or Soviet interference?" MacArthur's response, "Very little." On his side as well, Stalin had numerous discussions with his aides, debating what might happen next, as in this exchange on October 5th, just a few weeks from the one we described between Truman and MacArthur. And Stalin said, "The United States was not prepared at the present time for a big war. They would have to give in to China, backed by its Soviet ally, in the settlement of the Korean question." So both sides, it seemed, believed the other would back down if more force were applied. As it turned out, both sides were wrong. In November, MacArthur began to bomb some of the bridges across the Yalu River. And again, much of his rhetoric suggested that he was itching to cross the border and launch the war into China itself. On November 26th, the Chinese forces invaded Korea en masse, capturing large numbers of American and South Korean prisoners. 33 Chinese divisions smashed into MacArthur and American troops. A chaotic retreat commenced in the aftermath, and eventually the United States troops fled to the south, holding the line at the 38th parallel. So why did the Chinese invade after all of this debate and discussion? Well, again, historians have arrived at lots of different conclusions about this, and so what I'll mention here may be only part of the answer. But certainly among their considerations were concerns about their own security. They feared an American invasion, particularly after many of MacArthur's public comments. They also may have wanted a communist ally to the south, and the prospect of a unified communist Korea was an inviting one. This also spreads into the realm of the worldwide spread of communism. Mao also may have felt that he was repaying a debt to North Korea, and Kim Il-sung in particular, who had aided Mao in his fights in China. And so this might also have been a part of fulfilling the verbal agreement between Stalin, Mao, and Kim Il-sung in Korea. Although studying the documents involved in that discussion, there was a lot of back and forth on all sides, and so the commitment was not terribly firm. In any case, the United States and United Nations forces were driven back during that period before eventually restoring the balance at roughly the 38th parallel. Incidentally, the Chinese invasion began to mark a turn in MacArthur's reputation, as he managed a chaotic retreat, which eventually did restore order, and ultimately the American forces were able to escape and survive. His reputation faded because he had underestimated the threat of Chinese intervention, which proved to be devastating to the American and United Nations effort. Ultimately, it was superior American and thus United Nations firepower that carried the day. The United States completely controlled the air over Korea, and the North Koreans had almost nothing of an air force that could counter the United Nations efforts in that regard. The war also featured many vicious bombings of cities primarily in the north but also in the south, as UN forces attempted to terrorize and drive into submission the North Koreans. Much of the countryside in Korea was left in ruins in the aftermath of this war. As I mentioned in the introduction, while this war may sometimes be forgotten, for those who fought it, the war itself was miserable, and especially in the winter months, it was brutally cold. In the battle for the Chosin Reservoir, for instance, American troops were cut off as they attempted to retreat, and were held under siege by a huge mass of Chinese troops. It was only the intervention of American air power that supported those troops, and they were able to survive by a brutal, hasty, and extremely difficult retreat. But they were nearly annihilated by the huge number of Chinese troops overrunning them. This is the so-called battle for Frozen Chosin, and you can look up documentaries about this or find clips on YouTube describing in more detail the horrible conditions under which they fought. It's in this period that MacArthur and Truman began to differ on how best to pursue the war, most notably in how aggressively to push back against the Chinese. Initially, MacArthur underestimated and then even dismissed the threat of Chinese intervention. After the Chinese attack, he then argued that there must be no limits on American efforts to achieve victory over the Chinese. While he later challenged Truman's claim that he wanted to deploy nuclear weapons against China, MacArthur was vocal about his desire to defeat the Chinese. He considered but never acted on the thought of using chemical weapons against the Chinese. Truman feared that taking on the Chinese too aggressively might provoke a response from the Soviets, meaning World War III. The last straw came on April 5, 1951, when an open letter from MacArthur was read aloud on the floor of the United States Congress. In part, MacArthur wrote, "It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest, and that we have joined the issue thus raised on the battlefield. That here we fight Europe's war with arms, while the diplomats there still fight it with words." Soon after these comments, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command, concerned that his overaggression might spark World War III. Incidentally, this action by Truman was poorly received by the American public, who knew MacArthur as a war hero whose popularity far exceeded that of Truman. Amidst a host of other issues, Truman's approval ratings tanked, sinking to an all-time low of 22% at one point. MacArthur famously said in his farewell address, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." And he faded away into retirement, still regarded by most Americans as one of our greatest soldiers ever.